From a distance, the answer seems obvious. A steep pyramid, twin stairways, priests at the summit, a city gathered below. But the closer we get to the world of the Aztecs, or Mexica, the stranger that question becomes. Because an Aztec temple was not simply a building you entered. It was a layered sacred machine. It was a mountain built by human hands. It was a stage for ritual, a storehouse of offerings, a political statement in stone, and in its deepest core, a kind of buried memory. To ask what was inside an Aztec temple is to ask what the Mexica believed the universe itself was made of. At the heart of their capital, Tenochtitlan, stood the most important of them all, the Templo Mayor, the Great Temple. It rose in the middle of the sacred precinct, the ritual and political center of the empire. When the Spanish arrived in 1519, this was the structure that dominated the ceremonial core of the island city. It was massive, brightly painted, covered in stucco, and crowned by two shrines at the summit, one for Tlaloc, the rain god, and one for Huitzilopochtli, patron deity of the Mexica, linked to war, fire, and the sun. That detail matters because it tells us something essential right away. The temple was never just one thing. It was built around duality, water and war, fertility and conquest, agriculture and empire. The official museum at Templo Mayor still presents the monument through those paired forces, because the temple itself was designed to hold them together. The northern side belonged to Tlaloc. The southern side belonged to Huitzilopochtli. Two stairways rose side by side toward two sacred destinations, and that split at the top was not an architectural accident. It was a map of how the Mexica understood power, survival, and cosmic balance. So, what was inside? The first surprise is that the biggest part of an Aztec temple was not a wide interior hall, like many people imagine. The great temple pyramids of central Mexico were largely solid masses of stone, rubble, fill, plaster, and construction layers. Their most important accessible spaces were often not deep chambers in the middle, but the shrines on top, the platforms, the stairways, and the ritual surfaces, along with the caches buried within the body of the monument. In other words, the temple's inside was not empty space. It was packed with meaning, and that is where archaeology changes everything. For centuries, the Templo Mayor lay buried under colonial and modern Mexico City after the Spanish destroyed it in the 16th century. Then, in 1978, workers uncovered the great circular stone of Coyolxauhqui, a goddess from Mexica myth. That discovery launched the modern Templo Mayor project and transformed what scholars could know about the sacred center of Tenochtitlan. Since then, excavations have revealed not only the exposed ruins of the temple and neighboring structures, but more than 200 ritual offerings and multiple construction stages hidden in and around the monument itself. That means the question is no longer hypothetical. We do not have to guess what was inside an Aztec temple. Bit by bit, archaeologists have opened it, and what they found is a buried cosmos. Start at the summit, because that is where the temple announced its most visible identity. Broad stairways climbed the western face of the pyramid toward the twin shrines. The shrine on the north side was dedicated to Tlaloc. The one on the south side was dedicated to Huitzilopochtli. According to the Met, those temple structures housed the images of the two deities. This was the most sacred destination in the complex, not a giant congregation hall, but elevated sanctuaries where divine presence was concentrated. From below, the people of Tenochtitlan would have seen the temple as a mountain rising above the city. At the top, the gods were waiting. If you had climbed those stairs in the late 15th or early 16th century, you would not have entered a quiet place. You would have entered a charged, ritual environment. Priests served specific temple cults, and the priesthood in Tenochtitlan was highly organized. Sources summarized by Britannica describe a large professional priesthood, with high priests of Tlaloc and Huitzilopochtli standing at the top of the religious hierarchy in the capital. An Aztec temple, then, was not only a sacred structure, it was a working institution, maintained by specialists who oversaw ceremonies, novices, sacred calendars, temple lands, and ritual obligations. Inside the summit shrines there would have been divine images, ritual equipment, and offerings, but the living atmosphere mattered just as much as the objects themselves. Braziers burned, incense rose, sacred vessels held water or offerings, Musical instruments, knives, masks, and ceremonial objects formed part of the ritual world tied to the temple. The Templo Mayor Museum's collection, drawn from excavations at the site, includes skull masks, braziers, knives, greenstone masks, funerary urns, and symbolic objects associated with offerings, war, sacrifice, fertility, and death. These are not random leftovers. They are clues to the material language of temple life. To understand that world more vividly, it helps to picture the two summit shrines not as bare stone huts, but as highly coded sacred environments. The Tlaloc side was associated with water, fertility, and agricultural life. Sources on Tlaloc's cult note that the north side of the temple belonged to him, and that the stairway to his shrine was marked in blue and white, colors tied to water. The Templo Mayor Museum underscores the same symbolic language. Tlaloc appears on blue vessels used to hold water. A stone conch shell stands for fertility, and small images of the Tlaloc, the rain god's assistants, evoke the forces believed to bring rain to earth. In other words, one half of the temple carried the imagery of wet season, nourishment, and life-giving abundance. The southern shrine spoke a different sacred language. There, the world of Huitzilopochtli was expressed through war, fire, solar force, and dynastic identity. The museum's holdings from the Templo Mayor include a monumental sculpture of the Xucoatl, the fire serpent, the deity's mythic weapon, as well as sculptures thought to represent the Senson-Huitznahua, the divine siblings defeated in the god's foundational myth. An eagle warrior sculpture found beside another similar figure in the House of the Eagles shows just how tightly royal power, military symbolism, and temple ritual were woven together. So inside the Aztec temple, the gods were not represented in a generic way. Each sacred side had its own vocabulary of materials, creatures, colors, and mythic references. This makes the Great Temple feel less like a single monument and more like a controlled collision of worlds. On one side, rain, water jars, fertility, conch shells, agricultural hope. On the other, eagles, fire serpents, martial prestige, and the mythic victory of Huitzilopochtli. The Mexica did not separate those forces because they could not. An empire on an island city needed both. Crops could not fail. Enemies could not be allowed to overwhelm the state. At the summit of the temple, those needs became sacred architecture. Inside the monument below, they became buried offerings. But if the summit was where the gods were addressed, the body of the temple was where the gods were fed, remembered, and embedded into the monument itself. This is the second great surprise inside an Aztec temple. The monument was alive with deposits. Offerings were not simply placed in front of the temple, many were sealed into it. The official museum guide notes that offerings were deposited during different construction phases of the building in several forms, including fill, cists, and stone chests. That tells us the temple was not built once and left alone. It was enlarged again and again, and with each rebuilding, objects were placed inside it with precise ritual intent. The interior of the temple was, in effect, a ritual archive. Archaeologists have identified 7 major building phases at the Templo Mayor between the foundation of Tenochtitlan and the Spanish conquest. Each expansion wrapped earlier versions within newer layers. So inside the final monument were older temples, older offerings, older surfaces, and older acts of devotion, all physically enclosed by later construction. That means that to excavate the temple is not simply to dig downward. It is to move backward through time, ruler by ruler, phase by phase, ceremony by ceremony. In a way, the inside of the temple was history made solid. Imagine cutting through the structure. You would not find one clean, empty chamber. You would find retaining walls, compact fill, old platforms entombed inside newer ones, buried stair segments, serpent head sculptures, offering boxes, and ritual deposits set in exact positions. The Mexica did not rebuild by erasing the sacred past. They rebuilt by engulfing it. Each ruler enlarged the monument, but the older sacred core remained within, sealed and preserved. A temple could therefore contain not just sacred things, but previous versions of itself, and the objects hidden in those layers are astonishing. Excavations have uncovered caches filled with greenstone figures, marine shells, coral, beads, knives, animal remains, conch forms, masks, and ceremonial objects brought from regions far beyond the Basin of Mexico. In 2023, archaeologists announced another stone chest at Templo Mayor containing 15 greenstone figurines along with beads, snake-shaped earrings, and nearly 2,000 marine elements, including shells and corals, dating to the reign of Moctezuma I. Earlier discoveries included more than 160 starfish deposited in an offering linked to Huitzilopochtli. In other offerings, archaeologists found the remains of jaguars and other powerful animals among shells and ritual objects. This is one of the most revealing answers to our question. What was inside an Aztec temple? The sea was inside it. At first, that seems impossible. Tenochtitlan stood in a highland lake basin, yet the temple held shells from distant coasts. Corals, conchs, starfish, and marine creatures transported hundreds of miles inland. Some of these deposits were associated with Tlaloc and fertility, which makes immediate symbolic sense. Water belonged to the logic of rain, lakes, crops, and agricultural life. But marine offerings also appear in contexts associated with Huitzilopochtli and other deeper cosmological meanings. The temple was not merely receiving pretty exotic objects. It was assembling the natural world in concentrated form. Ocean and mountain, dry season and wet season, sky and earth, warfare and sustenance, all of it was being folded into one sacred structure. The museum's own interpretation of Room 3 makes another point easy to miss. Many materials excavated at the main temple came from places far from Tenochtitlan and reflected both trade and war. So the inside of the temple was also full of empire. Tribute was there, conquest was there. Objects from distant peoples and landscapes were brought into the heart of Mexica ritual life and placed before the gods or buried in the monument. In stone boxes and sealed deposits, the empire was miniaturized and handed over to the sacred center. That gives the temple an entirely different kind of interior. It was not just a place people entered, it was a place where the wider world entered. The same is true of animals. Offerings from the sacred precinct and Templo Mayor have included birds of prey, jaguars, wolves, aquatic creatures, shells, fish, and other species selected with tremendous symbolic care. The point was not display in a modern sense. It was transformation. A jaguar was not merely an animal. An eagle was not merely a bird. These creatures carried associations with warfare, power, the sun, the night, prestige, and divine force. Deposited inside or beside the temple, they turned nature into cosmology. And then there is myth. One of the most important clues to what an Aztec temple contained lies at the foot of the southern staircase. The Coyolxauhqui stone, discovered in 1978, was originally positioned below the stairway leading to the shrine of Huitzilopochtli. The goddess appears dismembered, referring to the Mexica myth in which Huitzilopochtli defeats his sister Coyolxauhqui on Coatepec, the Serpent Mountain. According to Smart History and the Templo Mayor Museum, the monument's placement was deliberate. The temple itself evoked sacred mountains, and ritual action on the stairway reenacted divine events from mythic time. That means another thing was inside the temple. A story. Not a story in books. A story built into architecture. The Met explains that the twin pyramids symbolized two sacred mountains. Tlaloc's side represented the Hill of Sustenance, Tonacatepetl. Huitzilopochtli's side represented Coatepec, the hill of his mythic birth and victory. So when the Mexica stood before the great temple, they were not looking at a building in the modern sense. They were looking at a constructed landscape. To go up the stairs was to ascend a myth. To deposit offerings inside the pyramid was to seed that myth with material power. To perform ceremony, there was to collapse historical time into sacred time. This is why so many of the objects found inside the temple seem to come from different worlds at once. Some belong to water and fertility, some to war and royal power, some to death, some to the earth, some to fire. The temple was trying to contain a complete universe in ceremonial form. Even the museum that now houses its excavated objects is organized around those oppositions and relationships: war and sacrifice, tribute and trade, Huitzilopochtli, Coyolxauhqui, Tlaloc, flora and fauna, agriculture, and historical transformation after the conquest. That organization reflects the logic already built into the monument itself. Even the earth itself had a place in this interior universe. At the museum entrance lies the great monolith of Tlaltecuhtli, the earth deity, originally placed at the foot of the main temple. The museum explains that warriors who died in battle or on the sacrificial stone, and women who died in childbirth after being devoured by Tlaltecutli, gained the privilege of accompanying the sun in its daily journey. That belief reminds us that an Aztec temple did not divide life, death, sacrifice, earth, and rebirth into separate categories. They were all part of one sacred cycle. So when objects were buried inside the temple, they were not disappearing into nothing. They were returning to a charged earth, into a sacred body that linked death, regeneration, and cosmic continuity. So if you ask what was inside an Aztec temple, one answer is gods, another is offerings, another is buried architecture, but a deeper answer is that what lay inside was a model of the cosmos. And yet the temple was also intensely human. We often talk about monuments as though they are abstract, but real people climbed these steps. Priests fasted, trained, and carried out ritual duties here. Rulers enlarged the structure when they took office. Craftsmen carved serpent heads, masks, vessels, and monumental sculptures. Traders and tribute networks moved exotic materials into the capital. Farmers depended on the rains linked to Tlaloc's favor. Warriors were tied to Huitzilopochtli's sacred sphere and to nearby ritual spaces like the House of the Eagles, where eagle and jaguar warriors gathered in a building beside the Templo Mayor. The inside of the temple was therefore not cut off from everyday life. It was the place where daily life was translated into sacred obligation. Even what stood next to the temple helps us understand what was within it. The official Templo Mayor site highlights the House of the Eagles, a wall of skulls altar, and the monolith of Coyolxauhqui among the great discoveries of the complex. These surrounding structures tell us that the great temple did not operate in isolation. It was the center of an entire ritual landscape. So when we imagine the temple's inside, we should not imagine only hidden deposits in a pyramid core. We should also think of the network of adjacent sacred buildings, altars, processional movement, and ceremonial spaces that gave those deposits meaning. Still, the deepest revelations come from the deposits themselves, because they show that the Mexica were not merely decorating sacred architecture, they were charging it. Consider the logic of placing objects in cists, boxes, and fill during construction. These were not casual acts. The position of objects mattered, their combinations mattered, their origin mattered, their material mattered. Greenstone, shells, animal remains, masks, weapons, effigies, and vessels were assembled according to ritual programs that archaeologists are still working to decode. Some offerings seem tied to specific deities. Others may mark dedications, renewals, expansions, or acts of imperial display. Together they suggest that every major enlargement of the temple was also an act of consecration. The structure was not complete until it had been spiritually populated from within. There is something almost paradoxical about that. The most important contents of the temple were often meant never to be seen again. In our world, value is linked to visibility. In the Mexica sacred world, value could be linked to concealment. A shell hidden in darkness beneath tons of masonry still mattered. A figurine sealed in a stone chest still acted. An offering buried inside the body of the temple still participated in the relationship between humans and gods. In fact, its hiddenness may have been part of its power. The object was not on display to impress the crowd. It was entrusted to the monument itself. That may be the single most important shift in perspective. When modern viewers hear the word inside, they imagine rooms. The Mexica often imagined layers. Inside meant beneath the floor of a shrine platform. Inside meant under a serpent head. Inside meant sealed in a chest, embedded in fill, or entombed within an earlier construction phase. Inside meant placed under the feet of the gods, beneath the path of ritual movement, or within a mountain of stone that symbolized creation, rain, warfare, and divine birth. The temple was not hollow because it did not need to be. It was dense, it was loaded, it was full. And this helps explain why discoveries at Templo Mayor keep changing how we see the Aztecs. Every new offering broadens the map of the Mexica world. A cache of marine life reveals the reach of imperial networks and the symbolic importance of water and the underworld. A group of greenstone figurines hints at curated objects with long histories before they were buried. Animal remains suggest ritual selection, captive management, and sophisticated symbolic programs. Architectural layers reveal how rulers used rebuilding to connect themselves to sacred continuity. The temple was never static. It was a growing machine for making power visible above ground and storing meaning below it. Seen this way, the temple interior was almost biological. It accumulated layers the way a tree accumulates rings, or the way the earth accumulates strata. Each phase enclosed another. Each deposit marked a moment of contact between ruler, priesthood, city, and deity. Each object changed the monument from a mass of masonry into something inhabited. The temple grew, but it also remembered. And that may be why the discoveries beneath modern Mexico City feel so powerful now. Every sealed chest and buried offering is not simply an artifact cache. It is a surviving heartbeat from a monument that was designed to contain time itself. That power was political as much as religious. At the center of Tenochtitlan, the great temple announced who the Mexica were and how they understood their place in the world. The monument fused divine legitimacy with state authority. Its top shrines bound reign and war together, two conditions essential to imperial survival: crops to sustain the population, conquest to sustain tribute and prestige. Materials from distant lands displayed the empire's reach. Ritual specialists upheld a complex sacred order. In that sense, what was inside an Aztec temple was also the logic of the empire itself. And yet, for all its scale, the temple could also become intimate. A vessel, a mask, a shell, a figurine no taller than a hand. The inside of the monument was built out of countless small acts of placement. Someone carried those objects. Someone selected them. Someone wrapped them, arranged them, buried them, and sealed them away. The great temple may dominate our imagination as a vast pyramid, but its interior meaning was assembled object by object. A civilization was speaking in deposits. This is why the archaeological record at Templo Mayor feels so human. The monument's great outlines are imperial, but its buried contents preserve moments of decision. Here, a box of marine offerings. There, a concentration of sacred blades. Elsewhere, effigies, animal remains, and symbols of fertility. One ruler expands, another consecrates, another adds a layer. Over nearly 2 centuries, the temple becomes a stratified record of devotion, ambition, fear, gratitude, and sacred obligation. The destruction of the temple after the Spanish conquest adds one final layer to the question. The conquerors dismantled the monument, built over it, and for centuries the sacred center of Tenochtitlan lay buried under the colonial and then modern city. In a strange way, the temple itself became an offering to time, sealed, fragmented, hidden beneath streets and buildings until archaeology began to uncover it again. UNESCO notes that the latest finds at Templo Mayor continue to deepen understanding of the pre-Hispanic city beneath modern Mexico City. The inside of the temple is still emerging. So, what was inside an Aztec temple? At the top, shrines housing the images of gods. On the stairways and platforms, the theater of ritual. In the surrounding precinct, altars, warrior spaces, and skull displays tied to ceremony and power. In the body of the monument, older temples wrapped inside newer ones. In sealed boxes and cists, offerings of greenstone, shells, coral, masks, blades, vessels, and precious objects from across Mesoamerica. In animal deposits, eagles, jaguars, and other creatures transformed into sacred signs. In architecture, myths made permanent. And in the deepest sense, inside the temple was the Mexica vision of the cosmos itself. Water and fire, life and death, rain and war, earth and sky, empire and devotion fused into one mountain of stone. The question sounds simple, but the answer is bigger than any chamber. An Aztec temple did not hide a single secret room. It hid an entire worldview. What we call the inside of the temple was, for the Mexica, the place where the visible world met the invisible one, where power was buried so it could endure, where memory was enclosed in stone, where each rebuilding preserved the past instead of replacing it, where mountains could be made in the middle of a lake city, and seas could be carried into their depths, and where the gods, if properly honored, might continue to hold the world together a little longer. That is the real wonder of the great temple of Tenochtitlan. Not simply that it was huge, not simply that it was beautiful, not simply that it stood at the center of an empire, but that inside it, hidden from view, the Mexica placed a version of the universe they were trying to sustain. And thanks to archaeology, stone by stone, offering by offering, layer by layer, that universe is speaking again.